Do you find that when you're using a compressor that it's negatively impacting your sound? Sure, you might be seeing all these other engineers using compressors, but if you don't ultimately know what you're doing, or if you don't know how to utilize that compressor on your track in the right way, you might actually be negatively affecting your song. And just because everyone is doing it does not necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. Now, that being said, when I sit down and approach compressing a track, I always want to keep things very transparent and musical, and there's a few different techniques you can use to ultimately achieve that. And in today's video, I'm going to highlight one of my favorite techniques, which is called serial compression. If you've never heard about this before, don't you worry. We're going to talk all about that, and I'm going to show you how to use it in your mix so you can sound better today. Are you ready? Let's go. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is your boy, Five-Piece producer and engineer extraordinaire, and I think a cool place to start, as always, is to first define what serial compression is. When we're typically sitting down to compress a track, we're usually using one compressor. We're putting it on the track, we're playing with the threshold, the attack, the release, the gain, and ultimately we're reducing the loud parts of that track so it comes down in volume, and we're adding some makeup gain to increase the quiet parts of the track so that basically the loud comes down, the quiet comes up, and the overall track gets a little bit more bridged together in volume, or glued as people like to say it. Well, the problem is sometimes when we do this, it's a little bit too aggressive and it sounds noticeable. You can hear that the peaks are coming down. You can obviously just tell that there's some compression happening, or maybe it's just sucking the life out of the track. These are all common symptoms, but we also want to use compression to increase the overall average volume of the song so it cuts better, so that you can hear it on smaller speakers, laptops, cell phones, earbuds, things of that nature. So it's kind of like a necessary evil at the same time to get your track to cut. Now, what I like to do is I like to use serial compression, and I know you're wondering what that is. So instead of basically doing what I said in that example, instead of having one compressor doing all the work, serial compression is when you take that compressor and you divide the task of compressing the song or the track or whatever you're applying it to across multiple compressors. So instead of having one compressor driving the volume of a track down 3 to 6 dB, let's say 6 for example's sake, you can have two compressors, each reducing the volume by about 3 each, also equating to a 6 dB reduction in volume. And what that ultimately allows you to achieve is a much more transparent and clean sounding track or song, makes things a lot smoother, a lot less noticeable, and it still preserves the energy and life in your track. I'm going to show you exactly how to do this in just a moment. But before we get there, I want to ask if you could please like this video, subscribe to the channel. I drop something new every single week, always focused on helping you sound better and helping you make more money with your music. If you want help with these two very key areas for every artist's career, I definitely encourage you to subscribe, and I appreciate you for doing that because that helps my content reach more people like yourself. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about how I use serial compression. I'm going to specifically show you how to do this with a vocal. So I got a song here in typical fashion, and what we're going to do is first we're going to just create a standard compressor, right? So I'm going to use an R comp, and I'm going to do this to ultimately compare, how does just, standard compression, downward compression like we would normally use it, how does that stack up in comparison to using serial compression? So let's set up this compressor like we normally would. I'm going to breeze through this, but again, if you want to learn more about compression, I'll leave a link up above to a video all about compression that you can watch. But I'm going to set my ratio to 2:1. I'm going to make my attack very slow, and I'm going to make my release pretty quick. Let's say 50, so kind of between quick and medium. I'm going to leave my extra settings here. We could just sort of forget about those for a second because depending on what type of compressor you're using, you may or may not have access to that. But all these other features, threshold, attack, release, gain, ratio, all that stuff you're going to find on pretty much every type of compressor. So I've set this up without even listening to it, but let's now dial in the threshold. So I'm going to bring the threshold down. I'm going to look to get, let's say, upwards of 3 dB of compression. So I'm losing 3 dB of volume on, excessive peaks. And then I'm going to bridge the gap of volume by essentially adding gain. So if I'm losing 3, I might add 3 back, but I'll do that at the very end. So let's set this up real quick. Check this out. And this is just the vocal soloed for the sake of this lesson.
I know what's involved. You can tell you don't. Think you know it all, but you got a long way to go. You just want what you don't have, not thinking about what you do.
So we're hitting roughly 3 on average. You know, I'm obviously not playing the full thing here, but you can see that we're hitting that 3. You can hear the volume actually coming down, almost like somebody's riding a volume fader. And right now, let me actually add 3 dB back. Let me see if this sounds pretty smooth. And what I'm ultimately going to look for is I'm going to bypass this a few times. I want to essentially get the volume to sound roughly the same with or without the compressor. All right, I'm just really trying to use this compressor to catch the peaks, the excessive loud parts, bring them down, and also to drive the volume up on the quieter parts that don't exceed the threshold. So the stuff that isn't loud enough to be compressed, essentially, right? So let's just check this out. I'll play it, bypass it a few times, and maybe I'll dial in the gain a little bit tighter, but let's just see.
I know what's involved. You can tell you don't think you know it all, but you got a long way to go. You just want what you don't have, not thinking about what you do. Spend so much time focused on it instead of thinking about your next move.
It's a little bit louder, but I think it's going to be fine. I'm going to try to match this. Because I'm going to now duplicate this R comp. I'm going to bypass the original one. And we're going to set up serial compression now. So that first one we set up a little bit more in a standard way, or a little bit more aggressively, you could say, in some aspects, but still pretty transparent. But now I'm going to divide the task. So that one compressor losing 3 dB, I'm going to not do that. I'm actually going to set this up even more gently, even lighter. And we're going to essentially distribute the task on that one compressor across 2 compressors. And these 2 compressors are going to work, again, in unison, in tandem, to achieve a certain effect. Now, the logic here is the first compressor that I'm going to use here, we're actually not going to be adding any volume or anything like that. So I'm going to reset the gain, okay? But what I'm going to do is I want to lose, let's say, about 1 to 1.5 dB of volume, and I specifically want to lose it on the peaks. So what that's going to mean is it's going to mean I have to set the threshold, once again, uniquely to achieve that, desired reduction that I'm talking about. So let me play this and let's see what I do here. And again, just pay attention. This little yellow meter that you see coming down, that's the gain reduction that's taking place on this track. So check this out.
I know what's involved. You can tell you don't think you know it all, but you got a long way to go. You just want what you don't have, not thinking about what you do. Spend so much time focused on it instead of thinking about your next move. And me, I'm thinking about my next move. I gotta do what I gotta do.
So that seems to be pretty cool, okay? So the threshold is set obviously a little bit more gentle. If I compare it to the original, we have a threshold of minus 34.5. This one's minus 27. So it's obviously a little bit more gentle. All the other settings are the same. Ratio is the same, attack's the same, release is the same, but the gain is at 0. So what this is essentially doing is it's catching the peaks, it's bringing them down, it's leaving everything untouched. There's no volume being added. The quiet stuff is still staying at the same volume. And that quiet stuff is also not passing the threshold here. And that's perfectly fine. I'm not trying to get any additional volume out of this. I'm really just using this almost as like a safety to catch those extremely loud peaks. Now, the next compressor, that's going to be the compressor that I use to essentially drive the volume up. Okay, so now let's do that. So I'm going to close this and I'm keeping it in. I'm going to just copy this. And I'm going to now set this compressor up independently as well. But you're going to notice with this threshold, let's see how much gain reduction I'm getting right now. Let's actually put both of them up and compare the 2 of them. So the left one is the first compressor, and the one on the right is the second compressor.
I know what's involved. You can tell you don't think you know it all, but you got a long way to go. You just want what you don't have, not thinking about what you do. Spend so much time focused on it.
So it's subtle, but the left one is just reacting a little bit more aggressively so far. And that's fine. I just wanted to point that out and compare it. So now let's actually set this up appropriately. I'm going to actually reset the threshold. And we're going to basically dial this in, dial the threshold in for sure. And then I'm going to add some volume here on this second compressor once again. So the first one has no gain being added. The second one is where I'm going to be driving the volume up, as well as getting some additional compression. So we're roughly hitting that minus 3 of reduction, right? And if anybody's wondering, the reason why I'm trying to get to about minus 3, I find between minus 1 and minus 3 is pretty transparent. It's not always the most noticeable. Some people definitely compress their tracks a lot more. I like to do things very transparently and subtly, okay? So let's set this up. I'm going to dial the threshold in, and my goal is to get between 1 to 1.5 dB of gain reduction once again.
I know what's involved. You can tell you don't think you know it all, but you got a long way to go. You just want what you don't have.
Okay, so you see we're losing about 1.5, but remember we're also losing about 1 here. So I'm going to essentially drive this up to, let's say, 2.5 to start. And let's just see, how that sounds, okay?
I know what's involved. You can tell you don't think you know it all, but you got a long way to go. You just want what you don't have, not thinking about what you do. Spend so much time focused on it instead of thinking about your next move.
So you're definitely hearing it come up in volume. Presence is there. Not a huge crazy volume difference, but overall it's just sounding a little bit more flush. And of course, we're getting this compressor to now not work so aggressively because that first compressor is catching the peaks, which is what would really trigger this to react aggressively. And the second one is still catching those same peaks as well as some other stuff, but then driving the volume up. But first, let's just compare how things sound between the single compressor acting a bit more aggressively versus dividing the task of that one between the two in series. Okay, so check this out. This will be the series first, and then I'll bring in the single compressor.
I know what's involved. You can tell you don't think you know it all, but you got a long way to go. You just want what you don't have, not thinking about what you do. Spend so much time focused on it instead of thinking about your next move. And me, I'm thinking about my next move. I gotta do what I gotta do. On everything I put it all on that. I got plans I'm trying to execute. Take a risk while you still used to, cause you know that this isn't for you. Doing nothing yet, put it all on that. You gotta switch if you wanna show and prove.
All right, hopefully you can kind of hear the comparison. They're obviously similar in a lot of ways, but they are still different. And I know we are soloed here. I always recommend doing this in context, but for the sake of this lesson, I'm really focusing on the solo mode here. And ultimately what's happening is the single compressor sounds like it has a little bit more low end, a little bit more mud potentially, and it's affecting the harmonic content, the frequencies of this vocal sound differently, depending on whether I have it, one single compressor or split across two, right? So the split across two just sounds smoother, clearer, less aggressive, but then also still driving the vocal up so it becomes a little bit more forward in the mix, and that's exactly what I want. And I guess the question is, which one do you think sounds better, smoother, more transparent? My vote, of course, is going to be for the compressors in series, and I love using this technique to, of course, compress the sounds, shape them in a certain way, glue them together, bridge the gap between the loud and the quiet, but again, do it in a much more transparent way, because having one compressor reacting very aggressively is typically going to be a lot more noticeable than dividing this task across two compressors that are working a little bit more lighter, So to summarize, the way I typically approach this is I have my first compressor, which is essentially just catching the peaks. The settings are typically set something like this. You could obviously adjust them if you want to taste, but I have them set very transparent, slow attack, faster release, 2-to-1 ratio, adding no makeup gain whatsoever. And again, just catching those excessive peaks, those loud parts. So even if you look at your audio, it's going to obviously be catching stuff like this, but then maybe not necessarily affecting the stuff that comes after that loud peak or these quieter moments that are happening throughout the track. So the first compressor is just catching the peaks and doing nothing else. The second compressor is functioning a lot more like that original compressor that I set up, where it's still, very transparent, 2-to-1 ratio, slow attack, faster release, but then I'm obviously setting a unique threshold to still achieve that same gain reduction, let's say -1 to -1.5, and then I'm using the gain, the makeup gain function on this compressor to drive the volume up to ultimately achieve a very cohesive sound that just gels everything together and stands out in the mix. So I hope you got value out of this video. If you did, please smash that like button. Hit the subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell as well to get notified. Again, I drop something new every single week, specifically for you, helping you sound better, helping you make more money with your music. And if you want to see anything in a future video, because someone actually requested this video and I made it just for them, do the same thing. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you want to see, and I'd love to shoot something specifically for you. All right? Looking forward to helping you guys again soon, and I'll catch y'all later. Peace.
5